Let's try to.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here in your seminar series. As Marcelo said, I graduated with my master's last spring, and I did that while working full-time as a green coffee buyer and roaster, and so I was working remotely. And now that I'm here on campus starting my PhD, I'm especially excited to be here with all of you and learn what you're working on and share a bit of what I'm doing with all of you. And so I didn't ask where the clicker was. I don't want to click it and break it. Awesome. And so as many people in this room, I'm sure, already know, global climate change is projected to impact pretty much every nook and cranny of our life. And one of the most critical aspects of our society that's likely to be impacted is the agricultural sector. And this is because changes associated with climate change in precipitation and temperature can make it really challenging for the production of major crop species, and especially those crop species that have really restrictive environmental requirements. And Arabica coffee production is one of those systems that has really, really strict environmental requirements, and it's also highly valuable. And so I'm particularly interested in coffee for a number of reasons. So first, it's an industry that impacts many, many people, a very roughly estimated 100 million people. And this entails everybody in this huge and complex chain. So we've got folks from farmers to pickers to mill workers, transportation professionals, exporters, importers, roasters, baristas, the list goes on. Many, many people from many different socioeconomic backgrounds. And to dig a little deeper into the farm end of that statistic, which is where I'm focusing on, there are an estimated 12.5 million coffee farms all over the world. And many of those farms are smallholder farms. So you have folks producing coffee using traditional methods or with limited economic resources to be able to respond to changes in climate, temperature, and rainfall, and also to respond to other challenges such as market volatility, for example. And it's not an industry that's focused in just a few countries. Coffee is grown on 4 continents in over 60 tropical and subtropical countries. So it's very widespread. And it's also important when talking about the future of coffee production, we have to talk about the fact that coffee consumption is on the rise. And it's on the rise in both traditional consuming countries and also traditionally producing countries. So as the ability to access coffee as a beverage and as demand for that coffee grows, it's going to put a pressure on producing countries to expand their production, whether that's via land area or via yields. And with all of this, it's important to note that coffee is incredibly sensitive to environmental changes. It has really strict environmental requirements that we'll talk about in just a moment. And so with that increasing economic value, coffee production could run into major obstacles in the future as we're facing major global environmental changes. And so coffee has a very strict temperature and precipitation requirement. So first, we'll talk about temperature. Coffee requires an average of 18 to 23 degrees Celsius annually. If coffee temperatures are too hot, that could lead to a decline in the quality of the coffee. And when we talk about quality, what we're talking about is attributes of flavor and aroma and aftertaste that are desirable in the coffee beverage. So sweetness, acidity, body balance, transparency, lack of defect. And that's all important because it adds to the value of the coffee harvest. So how much money farmers are able to get for that yield. And at temperatures that are too low, Coffee can withstand temperatures down to about 7 degrees. Anything below that will cause tissue damage. And so you can't go too high or too low. And those optimum temperatures, they vary with both the time of the day and with the developmental phase that that plant is in. So the coffee plant requires different temperatures in the seedling's first weeks, for example, or in initiation of flowering, development of first branches, fruit maturation. All of that has very strict temperature needs. And precipitation is also super important for coffee production. So coffee requires 1,200 to 1,800 millimeters of rainfall annually on average, but that number alone doesn't tell the whole story. Because with coffee, it's the timing as well as the quantity of precipitation that's super important. And so, for example, the plants require a 2 to 4 month dry period, followed by a precipitation event at the right time to trigger flowering. And then they need enough rainfall during the period of fruit maturation to be able to grow their harvest. So changes in that, in the timing and the quantity of precipitation, which are both expected under climate change, could have serious impact for coffee producers. And so this is a map showing, oh no, it's not. This is a map showing the current suitability for coffee production in across the world. And so this map is showing both Arabica production and Robusta production. So Robusta is the second most common commercially planted coffee species across the world. So this is showing all coffee. And we see that coffee grows right in this latitudinal band. We've got lots of coffee in southern Brazil, one of the most important coffee growing areas. We've got lots of coffee in Central America. We got lots of coffee in Africa and in Asia. Kind of spread out where when you think of coffee, where you'd expect it to be. And so this is a map from that same modeling study that shows loss of suitability for coffee production across the world. And so all of the red, orange, yellow, that's all showing where there is likely to be a decline in suitability for coffee growing. And the green areas show where there could be an increase in suitability. And we see, I mean, there's a lot of land area on this map that's red and orange and yellow. And so especially here, we have lots in Africa, we have loads of suitability loss in Brazil, in southern Brazil, and in Central America as well, and not a lot of green there. And so this study estimated that suitability for coffee production could decrease by up to 50% by 2050. And so how exactly will that happen? So what's going on that could impact coffee suitability loss? And so first, as we've discussed a little bit at this point, temperature could change. So as we've talked about, increase in temperature could lead to a loss of coffee quality, which could lead to a loss of value. We could also have increased occurrence of pests and disease. And that's particularly important as it regards to two of coffee's primary pest and disease challenges, which is the coffee berry borer and coffee leaf rot. So both of those are expected to increase in hotter, wetter climate conditions. We could also see an increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. And so much as we saw a couple years back in Puerto Rico, when they got hit by Hurricane Maria, it was devastating for the island's coffee agriculture and coffee infrastructure. And then finally, and I think super critically, is there could be changes to the quantity and the timing of rainfall. And that could vary globally. So we could see droughts, we could see less rainfall. We could see some areas may get more rainfall. And then probably even more likely is we could start to see variability and a lack of predictability, which could be just as challenging for coffee production. And so what can we do about it? So what are some potential solutions that folks have started to develop to be able to tackle this problem of climate change for coffee? And first, we've got shifting production to more suitable areas. And so this isn't necessarily a great solution when you think about it from an individual farmer standpoint. If that farmer doesn't necessarily have lands at higher elevations that will become suitable for coffee production, or doesn't have the resources to be able to, move their farm and move their whole producing capability somewhere else, then it's not necessarily a helpful solution. But that being said, there will likely be some shifts in overall production. And that could lead to issues of land use change and especially deforestation, as a lot of that land that could become suitable at a higher elevation is currently forested. And so the clearing of that land for agriculture could have also some negative effects. Another option for farmers who want to stay producing coffee on their lands is the option of value adding or diversifying their farming system. And so for value adding, you could add value to your coffee crops by, for example, accessing a third-party certification. So if you're producing organically, you can get an organic certification. There's Rainforest Alliance and Bird Friendly and Fair Trade and a whole number of third-party certifications that if you get one, it'll add some cents on the dollar to your coffee value. There's also the potential to access the specialty coffee market. And so the specialty coffee market, they will add a premium onto coffee prices if that coffee has certain levels of quality. And so quality, as I mentioned earlier, is, if that coffee is good, if it has favorable attributes, then you can get more money for your coffee harvest. Another option would be diversification. So a farmer could diversify into a totally different cropping system, such as having livestock. Or they could diversify by adding different tree crops, such as fruits or wood. So if you have a tree that you could eventually cut down to sell for wood, then that could at least diversify the revenue stream. So it's not fully dependent on coffee and its volatility. And so that kind of leads me into the next solution, which is the implementation of shade tree. And so shade plays many roles in a coffee Arabica system. As we just mentioned, it could provide another source of income, which is great. It could also provide nutrients to the soil. So if you have a leguminous shade tree, it could fix nitrogen in the soil, or the organic matter from the leaf residues could add nutrients to the soil that way. Shade also is known to play a role in modifying the microclimates for coffee plants. And so it modifies the temperature and the humidity and the levels of wind to create a more favorable environment for the coffee. And it also is known to play a role in self-regulation of pests and disease. So as we see increasing occurrences of pests and disease, having shade trees can help combat that issue. So all in all, it does seem like shade trees play a fairly good role in the development of a climate-smart coffee agro-ecosystem. And finally, and I think really importantly, is the use of improved cultivar selection for building a coffee agro-ecosystem that can respond to changing climate. So coffee plants, they're very long-lived. They can be around for 20, 30 years, for decades. And so planting decisions that are made today will still be impacting a coffee farmer, decades into the future when the environment that they're in could be vastly different. And so this could be a key tool to use to be able to have a coffee field that is optimized for now and for the future. And so this is just a quick graphic to give you a sense of the variety of coffee cultivars that are out there in the world. So this was made by Minneapolis-based coffee importer Cafe Imports. And essentially what it's showing you is just all the different lineages of coffee cultivars. And so, for example, we've got some Typico-related ones over there, and Ethiopian varietals over there, and some Canefra related over here. So it's very wide, and they all respond to conditions differently. And there's a lot that we know about those coffee cultivars that we saw in that last grain. We know a lot about their yields and about their quality, their nutrient requirements, their disease and pest tolerance. But we know all of that under generally normal conditions. And there's not a lot that we know about all those cultivars under atypical conditions. But we don't know a lot about how they'll respond to changes in environmental conditions, such as, and I think super importantly, water stress. And so I wanted to know a couple of questions. So the first question that I had was, to what extent does experimentally reducing rainfall impair coffee plant performance? So very first thing, would having rainfall reduced using rainout shelters, would that improve or impair coffee plant performance? And then the second thing that I wanted to know was, do responses of coffee cultivars vary in their response to reduced rainfall conditions? And so I selected 5 cultivars to use in my experiment. 3 of them are more traditional cultivars. So we've got Katsuai 44, Katsuai, and Viasarchi. Katsuai 44 is supposedly a drought-tolerant line of Katsuai, so that's why I chose to put that one in there. And the other 2 are more typically planted in the area. And so then we have 2 F1 hybrids, H1 and H10. And those are first-generation offspring of a hybrid crop of an Ethiopian cultivar and a Casimir/Sarchimar. And they are believed to be really high quality, really high yield, really tolerant to pests and diseases, but they're really new. So they were only bred in about 2010. So they're still generally unproven in the area. So a little bit more cutting edge than the other one. And so my hypothesis here was that the performance of all the cultivars would be impaired by the rainout treatments. But I thought that the F1 hybrids, so H10 and H1, would do better than the traditional cultivars. And I thought that because they have all of those other beneficial aspects, such as their higher disease and pest tolerance, their higher quality, their higher yield, they seem to just be overall better. And so my hypothesis is that they would do really well. And I also thought that Costa 44, which is meant to be a drought-tolerant cultivar, would perform good as well. All right, so I conducted my experiment in Costa Rica, which is a really important coffee producing region. So Costa Rica contributes 1.5% of global coffee production and 9% of Central American coffee production. So it's important both globally and regionally. My research site was in Santa Maria de Dota, which is located just about here in the middle of that blue section there on the map. And those are all coffee producing regions in Costa Rica there. The average temperature in Santa Maria de Dota, though it varies very quickly in the mountains, the microclimates can be pretty different, but the average temperature in the area is 19 degrees Celsius. The average rainfall annually is about 2,000 millimeters, and it operates in a wet and dry cycle of a system, with the rainy season running from about April, May to about October, November. My research site itself was on a coffee farm called Cafe Vino Tinto. Finca Vino Tinto is owned by a guy who actually lives in Florida. He exports his coffee, imports it to the U.S., roasts it, and serves it at his coffee shop in Safety Harbor. So if you're ever over in the Tampa area, I'd recommend going by his coffee shop. His coffee's pretty good. And so the coffee site itself, we planted it on a former pasture. The pasture was dominated by molasses grass and some other grass species before we converted it to our experiment. The soil pH is about 4.72. The slope is about 30%, and it faces northeast, east-northeast. And it's a really, really lovely place, surrounded by really excellent coffee. It's a really great coffee producing area. And so my experiment itself was a common garden experiment with 8 blocks. Each block had a treatment and a control plot. So over here on the left, those are our rainout shelters, our treatment. The rainout shelters had polycarbonate plastic roofing that provided 75% coverage to keep rain out of the plot. On the downhill side of all of the roofs, there were gutters and pipes that directed any water that fell on the roofs away from the plots. And there was also plastic sheeting buried around each of the plots to prevent subsurface and overland flow of water. The control plots over here, they had the same identical wooden structures, but with black mesh netting through instead of the plastic roof, be able to ensure that there was the same light availability in both the control and the treatment plot. Because coffee is a very shade-sensitive species, so I wanted to make sure that we weren't manipulating the shade in our treatment. These are just a couple more pictures of the shelters that I think are cool. They may look really kind of straightforward, but we really wanted this experiment to be able to last over a long time. And because the conditions are so hot and wet out there and the structures were wood, we worked with an architect over there on the left. His name's Larry Wines. He's a internationally renowned architect who I just happened to meet in the area, and he retired to Costa Rica, and he helped design these structures. And so he designed it so that there's metal in the soil so that the wooden poles wouldn't rot, and we could leave the structures up for a longer period of time. And then also, as the coffee plants grow, we wanted the structures to be able to grow with them. And so we also designed the structures to be fully adjustable. And so we can both adjust them to the slope, and we can adjust them as the plants grow. So that's really helpful for setting up this long-term experiment. And so in each plot, we had 35 plants, 7 plants of each of the 5 cultivars, and they were planted about 1/3 of a meter apart. And so anyone who knows anything about coffee production would know that that's very close together. And we planted them really close together in order to get more data on the land that we had. And then also because we knew that we were going to be removing a majority of the plants at the end of the experiment and just leaving about 12 in each plot to grow to maturity. And so it was all right planting them a little bit closer than normally would. And we got all the plants locally from ORC in San Marcos, Costa Rica, and they're all purchased in 2-liter bags at about a year old and all planted within the same week. So the first question is, did the treatment work? So did we reduce soil moisture in the rainout plots? And to test that, we took 10 measurements per plot of volumetric water content using a HydroSense tube. And what we found was, though the soil moisture varied with the time of year, as you'd expect with the rainy and the dry seasons, there was an overall 11% soil moisture reduction in the rainout treatment plots. So we can infer that we did have that precipitation and soil moisture reduction occurring in our treatment plots. We did also see a slight decrease in temperature, so about 0.5 degrees Celsius in the rainout treatment plots. But we think that there might have been an issue with the placements of the eye buttons in the canopy of the trees, and so we think that might have impacted our readings. And so at the end of last year, we went through and put some temperature and humidity loggers in 8 of the plots, hanging from the roofs of the plots to ensure that there wouldn't be any issue there. And then this summer, we went through and added 8 more. So now there are data loggers in all 16 of the plots, and when I'm able to take a look at that data, we can ensure that there's nothing else going on with the temperature and the humidity under the structures. All right, and so then we get to our data. So what actually happened with the plants under rainout and under control? And so to do this, we measured fruit production, which is arguably the most important metric from a farmer's standpoint, is did more fruit grow under one treatment than the other? And then we also looked at biomass, above ground biomass for a subset of the plants. So first we have fruit weight. And that measurement is the weight of all of the fruit produced per tree together, so not the weight of the individual. And what we found was that the average weight under rainout, surprisingly, was 3 times greater than the average weight under control, which is the opposite of what we expected would happen as we were trying to stress the plants with the rainout treatment. So what we saw was about an average of 60 grams for all the plants under rainout, and an average of 20 grams for all the plants under control, which is a full 3-fold increase in production under the rainout treatment, which is really interesting. And we also saw pretty clear differences among cultivars. And so, as you can see over there, we've got H10 and H1 there on the left, which responded really well, both under rainout and under control. And one of the things that I find really interesting about that, so over here, this light one is control, and they performed about as well, around 40 grams per tree under the less productive control than Katwai 44, which is the second most productive over there, about as well as they did under rainout. So to me, that suggests that they could do well under various environmental conditions. Could respond well depending on whether it's going to be more rainy or less rainy. And this is a coefficient plot just to give a better sense of kind of how the intercultivar variability played out with the different cultivars. We have control there on the left and rainout on the right. And what we're looking at is each of those blue dots is an estimate for one of those cultivars. And the black lines there are the 95% confidence interval line. And so the way it works is where that line doesn't cross 0, we can infer with confidence that it's different than that baseline number. And what I see here really clearly is that H10 and H1 perform significantly above baseline, whether it's control or rainout. So we have BSRG and Katwai performing substantially below baseline under both control and rainout. All right, and so the next metric is fruit count. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because, as you can see, it's very similar to the fruit weight number. We again see a 3-fold increase in number of fruits per tree under rainout, just like we saw a 3-fold increase in weight. And we see that same pattern of intercultivar variability. So we see the H10 and H1, those F1 hybrids, performing really well. And we see Katwai and BSRG performing significantly less well. And so just to make that super clear, there was a strong correlation there between fruit count and fruit weight. And so the next metric that we measured was above ground biomass. And although fruit production is really the important thing, it's really what we wanted to be looking at. The fruit production data coming from the plants was off plants that were only about 18 months old, which for a plant that lives for decades, that's pretty young. And it could be, a harvest coming from very, very young plants. And so we wanted to get biomass data just to give us a little bit more context, a little bit more understanding of what's going on with these plants. And so for biomass, we harvested the above ground biomass of 3 plants in each of the plots, for 3 plants in each cultivar in each of the plots, for a total of 240 plants. Dried those in ovens at 60 degrees Celsius to constant mass and weighed them. And what we found was a pattern that looks somewhat different than the others, but still really interesting. We see that there is still an increase in the biomass production of plants under rainout, but it's not as intense of an impact, as strong of a response as we saw for fruit production. So whereas fruit production was a 3-fold increase under rainout, what we're seeing here is an increase of about 51%. So there is still, we do still see a response, it's just not as strong. And we also see that the cultivars do differ from each other, so there is still that intercultivar variability. But with this pattern, it's more likely that that variability is due to genetic differences in plants' potential for biomass accumulation, less so in how they're responding to that rainout treatment. And so, as you can see here, we're looking on this slide at one block. So on the left, it's plot 7, that's a rainout treatment. Plot 8 over here is a control, and they're right next to each other. And as you can see, they look very different. And those differences became pretty clear pretty quickly in the experiment. And so it's obvious that what we set out to do, which was creating a more or less drought stress experience for the plants, didn't happen, but something else did. And what we think happened was that this period of the experiment, these 18 months, they were in especially high rainfall year. And so this area of Santa Maria de Dota and its surrounding mountains got a lot more rainfall than it typically does, along with several extreme precipitation events. What we think happened was that the rainout structures ended up protecting those seedlings from excess soil moisture. Pretty much every coffee farmer that I spoke with in the area while I was putting up this experiment, I would talk about how I was doing a drought stress experiment, and they'd look at me like, drought? Right now? And so that's what we think happened, and it still is a kind of interesting way to look at a different impact of climate change, which is when there's too much water stress occurring, when there's too much water occurring on a field site. And so there are still some benefits and some challenges to the results of this research. And so it seems pretty clear that the F1 hybrids could be a really good option for producers who want to withstand any major impacts of water stress with climate change. And so over here, this is a coffee farmer in the area, like right outside of Santa Maria de Dota. She was one of the local early adopters of F1 hybrids in Santa Maria de Dota. And she chose to plant those F1 hybrids because she knew about their increased quality, she knew about their increased yield, their resistance to nematodes and coffee rust, which are two major concerns in the area. And she was really happy with how her plants were coming along and was willing to invest in these plants up front. And that's where the challenge comes in, because the investment for these plants is much greater than the investment for traditional plants. And so the F1 hybrid cultivars, the seedlings cost about twice as much as the traditional cultivars. So where a VSRG or a Katoi seedling would cost about 50 cents, the H1 seedling that she had purchased cost about $1. So that's twice as expensive, which is a really, really big deal if you're planting your field. And that high price and that challenge harkens back to the fact that they are F1 hybrids, so they need to be clonally propagated. They can't be produced from seed like a typical seedling could be. And so this not only makes them more expensive, but it also raises questions of accessibility. So most farmers can't propagate clonally on their farm, whether they don't have the knowledge or the resources. It's not easy to propagate these plants clonally by yourself. And not many people do. And so being able to access those seedlings, you can't just drive around the corner to your local nursery. It would have to be through a lab, which could be quite a drive away. And the other issue is somewhat ethical from some folks that I've spoken with. Some coffee producers I've spoken with about it, it feels almost wrong that you can't produce your own coffee from your own seed. And so that's a framework change that'll have to be addressed if these coffee cultivars are going to be widely adopted. With that being said, I think that there is still some work to be done to be able to make my results more applicable in the field and more easy to utilize. And the first future study to be done is to process and evaluate the quality and the quantity of yield more accurately. So as I mentioned, my plants were really young. I got this harvest data. And I think that being able to harvest coffee that I can then process and evaluate the quality of would be really important. And so in this picture, for example, I'm in a lab in San Jose, and we're looking at different varietals, different cultivars from the same farm, and how they taste and how the differences are. And each one was on this table, and it really stood out in terms of quality. So it'd be really interesting to see whether water stress and changes in precipitation levels could impact quality of the seed, and if that varies by cultivar. And in addition, we need to do more long-term studies to see if those patterns hold over time. So be able to look and see if these were patterns that were just because it was the first year of that coffee plant's production, or if that pattern continues throughout the next few years. And there are a few key takeaways despite the need for several more studies to be done to ensure that our findings are usable. So first, I think it's pretty clear from the data that excess rainfall under climate change could impact coffee production. And second, I think it's also clear that cultivar selection could be a really useful tool for mitigating the impact of climate change. We saw such a strong response from those F1 hybrid cultivars, H1 and H10, and it could be used to ensure that whatever happens with climate in the future, whether it's more rainfall or less rainfall, that the cultivars that are selected could be and that information could also be useful for developing more detailed and accurate maps. And so at this point, climate models, they mostly use a general sense of how coffee in general will react to changing climate conditions. So with this kind of information about how specific cultivars respond to those changing conditions, we can get more detailed regional maps to better understand at a closer resolution what will actually. And so my final thoughts, I think coffee production is very important. And I think that it's likely to be greatly impacted by climate change. And it's also really surprising that there's just not that much data, there's not that much information about climate impacts on coffee agriculture. And I'm really excited to continue working on this topic. And I'm especially excited to continue learning from and with all of you to be able to help tackle this important challenge. So thank you to all the folks who have helped me with my research, and thank you all of you for your time.